So, when you're someone who loves all fishing disciplines, like I am, it can sometimes be hard to actually choose where to go next. A lot depends on the conditions, the season, and what's happening at that given moment in time. But underneath all that, there comes a choice only I can make. It's easy to follow the crowd, perhaps to listen to requests from the community, but in order to create something special, I need to feel it, have the passion for it, and ultimately, want to do it. In recent weeks, I've dabbled with carp angling, and the thought of sitting quietly beside a secluded pond, travelling light and stalking one or two carp from the margins appealed to me, as did taking a little boat out in search of a bass or two. I could spend a day wandering the wonderful River Wallington, seeking out the huge gudgeon that reside there, or I could travel east or west and find a wild and ferocious beach in search of late summer species. Whatever I was going to do, it needed to inspire me. That's the important bit. So, it was inspiration I saw, trawling through Facebook and YouTube catch reports in search of a spark, the hope to see something that would get me excited, a challenge that was achievable, yet not too easy. A quick stand in the shed sometimes brings inspiration too, just looking around at various pockets of tackle dotted around, perhaps a rod I haven't used for years, or a reel collecting dust and badly in need of some new line, perhaps a float I made many years ago that never got to see the water. It was there somewhere, I just had to find it. It was while staring at a perch float it came to me. I'd been toying with the idea of targeting the big perch on the Wallington for a good while. To spend a day armed with some worms, and to wander the banks for a day seeking all the likely looking spots, in the hope of meeting one of those river giants. So preparations were made, bait was ordered and tackle was readied. The day had come. I woke early. I had to get to the tackle shop as they opened to grab my worms, etc. A quick coffee and I was off to the shed. Tackle was simple. My creel loaded with the tackle box, bait box and scales. Inside was also a small centre pin loaded with 4-pound line. As I'd broken my river rod on a previous session, I chose a light split cane fly rod of 7 feet in length, perfect for skulking about amongst the undergrowth. I took a net as well, just in case we did come face to face with that monster perch. I was of course under no disillusion. A perch of 2 pound from the Wallington would surely be the holy grail, but to catch a perch over a pound would be an outstanding achievement, so a sensible target was made, although of course the number one target, as always, was just to enjoy the day. The day was perfect. I'd had great success with perch in the past, when it had been overcast with some drizzle. I seldom did well in bright conditions. A few days of heavy rain meant the river was up and coloured. Whether or not this would prove to be a good thing, I didn't know, but I was just about to find out. Boar hunt was the first base. Parking in the lay-by, from there I could travel upstream and downstream, seeking out perchy looking hideaways I could throw a few worms at. After all the rain we'd had, the ground was boggy. I walked with chicken steps, but still my socks became soaked after just a few minutes. It was definitely a welly day. The float I used on the day was your typical boys perch bobber float. Not one I'd made myself, although I wish I had, such was the craftsmanship. It looked gorgeous in the water, although a float is as pleasing in appearance as it is in disappearance, as someone once said. I began fishing, gliding my float through the faster runs and also trying those slower eddies, pools where I thought the perch might be hiding. Sometimes the float would run through at pace, other times it would skip, spin and pirouette, but for the first couple of swims anyway, what it didn't do was go under. Maybe it's an age thing, but these days I tend to scale those styles far more gingerly than I used to. Add to that the fact that the wood was damp, and we could well have had a recipe for disaster. Thankfully, I remained unscathed. The wonderful folk who look after the river do an amazing job, and these strategically placed stiles with pipe lagging over the barbed wire are a godsend. The next swim I came to was quite dark, such was the canopy of trees overhead. A fairly deep glide close to the bank produced a few bites, but I missed a lot of them. I put it down to the fact I was using large hooks and half a worm, as opposed to usually using a small size 18 and a single maggot. I wanted to single out the better fish on this trip, quality over quantity. The first fish that I caught, however, wasn't a perch, but a fairly large and greedy gudgeon. Although it wasn't the intended species, I couldn't be upset by its capture. It was a remarkable fish. Once the bites dried up, I was off on my travels once again, in search of a deep dark hole. And it was then I asked myself, if I were a big perch, where would I hide? It was starting to become a worry though. Not only had I not found any big perch, I hadn't actually caught any perch at all. I was sure I would though. I just had to keep on searching, keep the faith. The tackle I chose for the day was a massive success. The fly rod was light, short, and had the most wonderful action. The gudgeon I caught thus far was so much fun, although I did start to wonder what the bend would be like if I did manage to catch what I'd come for. And the more I watched that brightly painted little float, the more I fell in love with it. I headed for an area known as Boggy Style. It sounded a bit like something you'd call my dance moves. I knew it was the spot as there was a sign saying so, and although this was reputed to be a big perch hotspot, I couldn't even muster a bite. It was starting to worry me. Perhaps today really wasn't a perch day. There were so many good looking areas to fish, both upstream of the lay-by and downstream once I'd been back to the car for a boat to eat and a drink. I could spend literally all day fishing various swims, miles of gorgeous riverbank, relatively untouched land, natural and wild, full of wildlife, and quiet, save the odd car zooming down country lanes. The plan though was to fish the streams around Boar Hunt until shortly after lunch, and then to head to Southwark Pool for the rest of the afternoon. Of course, if someone was already there ahead of me, it would scupper my plans, but that was the backup plan anyway. I've caught perch from the pool before, although no decent ones, perhaps up to 8 ounces or so, but I had a good feeling if I targeted them properly, I could well be rewarded with that elusive 1 pound fish, maybe an even bigger one. At the pool there's a platform to fish from. I like to sit sideways on it. It gives a wonderful vantage point over the pool. I plumbed the depth and found it to be almost 5 feet deep, just a couple of rod lengths out. This had to be the spot. With half a worm as bait, it didn't take too long for the first bite to come, and thankfully we'd caught our first perch. A small fish of a handful of ounces, it epitomised the start of autumn, with blood red fins, spikes across the back, and dark barred flanks. It was just perfect. I fished on in the hope that sometime before dusk we'd connect with something slightly bigger. I was more than happy with those smaller hand-sized perch, but yearned for something larger than my hand. Over the next hour or so, I managed to catch a few little perch, as well as a roach and some gudgeon. It was the most delightful afternoon's fishing. The nearby road can spoil the tranquility if it's too busy, but somehow when you're concentrating, you lose the sound of the cars, fixated by the float and the quest at hand. Just to the left of the platform is a short path leading to a snaggy tree spot that juts out into the water. I thought this might hold a perch or two, but found that the flow came from under the tree, dragging my float out of position far too quickly. I could have ledgered there, but that's not for me. Not when perch fishing, there has to be a float. Back on the platform, I was soon back among the fish. Small perch as before, but I was just happy to be catching after a quiet morning at boar hunt. Bait for the day consisted of half a pint of red maggots for loose feed and a pot of dendrobinas. Dendrobinas are like lobworms, but smaller. I had a bite, just like any of the other bites, but upon striking I felt straight away that this one was different. It bored deep, remaining out of sight for a little while. I wondered if it might be a bream at first, or a carp perhaps, but as it turned for the first time I spotted the bars, the red fins. This was a perch, and a good one. As I made my way to the walkway to the left to grab the net, I felt something was wrong. The fish had found some underwater roots and was starting to get stuck. Using my wits, I kept the fish moving as much as I could, that way they don't get too entangled, and with constant pressure my prize was pulled free of the snags and safely into the awaiting net. This was over a pound, a fish I just had to weigh. The needle swung round to 1 pound 8 ounces, a cracker from such a small river, and it far exceeded what I'd set out to do. On the bank I stared at the fish for a moment. It was stunning, and quite big too, far better than anything I'd caught from the river before. Once the fish was returned safely, I even had time to catch a small green eel. It was lovely to see. I hear they're quite scarce these days. Soon after I decided I'd had my share, started to put things away and headed for the car. I have no doubt there were bigger perch in the river, but my thirst was well and truly quenched for now. I could always come back another day. On the way home I stopped at the hill for a look. On one side you have Portsmouth, a town busy and bustling as most towns are. Behind me on the other side we have the beautiful countryside of southern Hampshire. It's where the Wallington meanders through fields and woodland, and it's my little piece of heaven.